Hi, class. Today we're going to be discussing um, the Annis article, being virtuous and doing the right thing. First of all, apologies about that I set up the wrong articles in the Aristotle video. Um, so I was planning on using the Mayo and Frankena, and then I found the Annis article, which kind of covers a lot of the same ideas, but does so, first of all, in one article, but also in kind of a more approachable way because I don't know if you noticed it's from, it wasn't published in a journal, it was presented at the American Philosophical Association. Um, and so they tend to be a little more for non experts a lot of times as a result. Anyway, it's a good article. Um, and again, hits some of the main concerns that we raised with the Aristotle last time, and she re-raises them here. First of all, the big worry with virtue ethics is that it's too vague, and what she really means there is specific duties are unclear, and so that's the major worry. A second one is that it's too parochial, she says, because we kind of you're kind of collected these things and told ways to be from family and society and context. And so uh, that's kind of the starting point. Implicitly in the background, there's like, well, virtue ethics would be fine except for these problems, which seem significant. And so a lot of what she is doing to defend virtue ethics is simply to address these issues. First of all, I think she rightly points out about this too parochial, too parochial objection is, well, that's how any system of ethics starts, is we start with our family and our social context and our society and things like that. And then we use our everyday experience to kind of arrive at something richer eventually. But more important, so that's a quick aside that objection doesn't have the teeth it's kind of thought to begin with. But then she uses that to also develop into the much more serious objection, which is if you're not doing virtue ethics, that is, if you're doing action-based ethics, you arrive at this undesirable approach, or she's going to try to convince you it's undesirable. And this is what she calls the technical manual approach. How does this work? Well, again, we start with our everyday ethical intuitions and lives to arrive at a decision procedure. And because we are arriving at a way to decide, this people often take that to imply an action-based theory of ethics. So remember, there's kind of all the action-based theories of ethics, and then there's virtue ethics, whether we focus on actions or persons. But really, the seeming culmination and goal of action-based ethics is what she calls the technical manual. And she emphasizes that's not necessarily a bad thing, but ultimately it's what it's describing, that there's this list of, well, if you do ethics perfectly, you arrive at a manual. That is, you arrive at this instruction book that tells you exactly what you should do on any given action. And there's some good stuff about that. It's egalitarian. If theoretically anybody can do it, that is, seemingly everybody should do the same thing for if they're in an identical situation. It's direct, and so there's technical manuals have important uses, but she's going to distinguish four significant problems with that. Two of them she's leaning on a previous author as well. So uh, let's say you do perfect action-based ethics, and you arrive at this perfect technical manual of what to do. Well, first of all, this has one weird and counterintuitive result, that a child prodigy or a teenager could theoretically master this manual and therefore always know what to do. which would, of course, imply that teenagers can be experts in ethics, which she says is bizarre on the face of it. Well, no, ethics just seems to be the kind of thing where experience should matter, and that something a little deeper than memorizing a manual is required. Especially given the second objection is that someone could master the manual um, and know everything about it and still not actually follow it. That is, someone could know every word of the book, can tell you everything that you should be doing in this situation and what is correct, and still feel no impetus at all to do it. Can go on torturing kittens and what have you. And so this is really a motivational issue. Well, there seems to be this fundamental break between knowing what is right and doing it if you're an action-based theory of ethics. That, by the way, is something that the Frank Kenna article was going to lean on pretty heavily. But anyway, so those are the two kind of previous objections, and then Annis adds two more. First of all, is this really what we want out of ethics? Is it just to be told what to do? And obviously, she asked that as a rhetorical question. But the answer seems to be no. Well, I feel like ethics is something deeper, richer, more contemplative than just checking a box and say, "Yep, that's what I need to do." Uh, Something Nietzsche used to call the ethics of thou shalt. Um, but then lastly, the other new objection that Annis raises to the manual model is um, that ethics is such that praise and blame doesn't get shifted the way manuals do. So she gives the analogy of someone who simply just follows everything their mother says, regardless. Um, and that's not really praiseworthy. It's not living the right kind of life in certain ways. But if you replace the mother with the ethics manual, um, then you arrive at the same problem that, well, we would still blame someone even if they were, just following the manual, etc. And so, I feel like I expressed that last one a little poorly. Let me say just a little more. That when we are doing ethics, uh, and when we are evaluating people, we kind of just have these certain types of expectations that we use to apply praise and blame to various people and various actions. And we just don't get that here. So what she says, uh, my moral decisions are mine in that I am responsible for them, but in a further way as well. They reveal something about me such that I can be praised or blamed for them in a way that cannot be shifted to the theory I was following. This is so when it is true that the theory was correct, I was following the theory correctly, and the point of my following the theory was to be told to. Sorry, and that was on 721. So even if if I see you do something exemplary, I don't thank utilitarianism. I thank you. So there's something extra deeper going on here. And so for these reasons, this might be a motivator to get away from the technical manual theory, which is, again, she thinks, with all the bells and whistles stripped away, the ultimate goal of action-based ethics. When we switch to virtue ethics, you might say, well, wait a minute, virtue ethics still tells you in some sense how to act in a given situation. And she talks about this one kind of standard presentation of virtue ethics where we just simply ask, what would the virtuous person do? Which is another thing that was talked about in the Frank Kenna article. But that is simply another version of the manual model. And so The important point here is, well, if she's right that the manual model is a problem, then that can't be how virtue ethics is or should be defended. And so her solution then is to shift to what she calls the developmental account. Uh, and it adds a third thing. Well, yeah, we need to know, a virtuous person or a virtuous exemplar. We need to know and develop an account of right action. But we also need a developmental process of how we become these virtuous persons. And not just in terms of, well, we need an account so that people can figure this out, but rather the developmental account actually accounts for why virtue ethics seems to have unclear duties and why there's no one size fits all, etc. Because different people are in different stages of development, and as such, the way they act in a certain situation might be different depending on their theory of development. And so she, very unsurprisingly, whenever whenever somebody starts raising objections to virtue ethics, it's very often a version of virtue ethics that just gets too far away from the classics. And Anna says, well, look at classical virtue ethics, look at Aristotle. Aristotle gives the builder analogy that basically becoming a moral person, becoming a good person, is like becoming a good builder or architect, what have you. It is a techne, it is a practical skill, it is something that we work at in those ways, and she's going to lean pretty heavily on this analogy for the rest of the paper because it's important. So think of if you're a builder and all of a sudden you encounter a building problem, what are you going to do? The answer is it depends on how good a builder I am. If I'm just starting out, I might ask my manager or my mentor or uh, uh, the master. You'd be the apprentice, so you'd ask the master that you're apprenticed to. And that's kind of the same as the moral role models or the perfectly virtuous person. But if you're more along than that, you might try to figure things. You might try to figure things out in a certain way. And instead of thinking what your master would do, you might take your collective wisdom and apply and kind of make it, just as you make your skill your own, you would therefore make the solution your own. And so, as she's talking about, when we have these issues, we have to know, well, where am I morally speaking? Am I the expert? Am I the learner? Am I somewhere in between? Is really going to weigh in on how I'm going to approach this moral decision and this moral problem, etc. And my answer is not going to be the same as somebody else's, which is going to indicate we might approach things differently. That was skipping ahead a little, but let me also mention, uh, going back to the builder analogy. Well, yes, we start with a role model. Again, this is so Aristotle's account is in ancient Greece, where they have the apprentice and the master craftsperson. So uh, we might start with that, but that's certainly not the goal, right? And implicitly, if someone says, I want to be exactly like my master, well, they're never going to be a master because to be a master is to go beyond imitation in some sort. Again, think of artists instead of builders. Yeah, your goal is to develop your own style and technique and your kind of your I guess I already said it all. But yeah, no one's goal is to be exactly like their teacher. Your goal is always to make it your own and maybe even excel past your teacher, etc. And so uh, notice that's kind of why Annis is rejecting the version of virtue ethics that just says do what a virtuous person would do, because then all you're doing is trying to emulate someone. And so that's how the developmental account uh, kind of surpasses that other account of virtue ethics. Is we start with some sort of moral role model, but that's not our endpoint and that's not our goal. So I'm going to read just one more passage here on 725 is a good one. Right-hand column, how does this help us with the issue of being virtuous and doing the right thing? The learner starts by doing what he is taught is the right thing to do, copying the actions which in his society are conventionally marked off as the kind of things that, for example, a brave person does. As he progresses in virtue, he does these things as a virtuous person does them. So, uh, moving beyond the layperson to the virtuous person with understanding, and also gets better at doing the right thing. He acts bravely with greater understanding of what bravery requires, for example, and does the right thing as the truly brave person would do it from the right reasons as a result of having the right disposition and so on. So I feel like that's a good kind of place to end with the summary piece there. And so again, she's not necessarily going uh, too far beyond what Aristotle is doing, so much as kind of telling us why this Aristotelian approach is still very relevant, and if we really truly appreciate that approach, then we can start to see why that's going to cover some of the important, by cover I mean address and assuage some of the important objections that people raise to virtue ethics and Aristotelian virtue ethics in general, that it's too vague, that it has unclear duties, and that maybe it's in a sense relative because there's no one size fits all for everybody. And she's saying, well, those aren't weaknesses; those are actually, in an important sense, strengths, because we're not trapped in this technical manual model that has all of these shortcomings, and we don't want to be stuck in the technical manual model, which means when we turn to this way of doing things and we view ethics like other disciplines that require expertise, then we're going to have a richer approach to ethics. So this is certainly a good thing to talk about in the discussion board this week if you want to talk about this article specifically, or maybe more generally, does it seem better to approach things virtue ethics or action-based ethics? After today, we're gonna shift to talk about another action-based theory of ethics. Specifically, next time we're going to start talking about Kantian deontology. So Kant is action-based theory of ethics, but it's kind of the opposite of utilitarianism. Whereas utilitarian says only the consequences matter, Kant says no, we're screwing up ethics if we look at the consequences. Instead, we have to focus on something else, our will or our intent. Now, why is that sandwiched together in the unit with Aristotle? Because Kant is going to put this supreme high emphasis on rationality as well, and as something special that only humans do as well. But he's going to get some very different conclusions than Aristotle. So it'll be interesting, and we will see you next time.